Did you know that every note has 3 separate parts to it? A couple weeks ago, I went over a warm-up exercise that I called 3-part articulation, and in this video, I want to get a little bit more in-depth on what that means and what that actually looks like, and give you some visuals to sort of go along with it to help you really get your precise 3-part articulation down. If you didn't watch that live weekly warm-up, click the little link up there that I'll put to it. And remember that I do have a live warm-up every single Monday around 9:30 a.m. is going to be the new time for going live on Facebook and YouTube. And I go over a warm-up that I challenge you to implement into your routine for the week. And it's really a lot of fun. And of course, you're welcome to put any questions or comments or any thoughts that you have about those warm-up exercises over on those videos as well. And if you do it while I'm live, I'll answer your questions live usually. So go check that out and make sure that you maybe set a reminder in your calendar, or you could just hit the bell icon next to the subscribe button to make sure that you get notified of when I'm going live, so you can see all of those and come hang out and do some warm-ups with me. So this idea of 3 parts to a note, or 3-part articulation, comes from a audio sort of engineering and sound engineering idea called ADSR. I am by no means a sound engineer or big audio person, but I do have like a small idea of these things. And ADSR is this idea of attack, decay, sustain, and then release. So every sound really has an attack where it goes from there's no sound at all, and then there is sound. Then there's a little bit of decay usually from the initial attack, and then there's a sustain, and then there's a release where the note finishes off. So this is the sort of audio model. This might be how a piano sounds when you hit the piano key. There's a very fast beginning to the note, and then it sort of tails off a little bit, has some body to the note, some sustain, and then over time it decays. So this is the attack, decay, sustain, release part of it. In actuality, and especially for clarinet playing, this attack and decay bit are very quick. The attack might honestly be like just the briefest sound of your tongue coming off the reed before the sound starts going. And there isn't a big immediate decay as you get when you're plucking a string or hitting a string like with the piano, because we're able to keep the air going and keep the sound moving. And that's what's so cool about wind instruments. So I usually sort of combine these, and I call that the beginning of the note, and then the sustain is the middle, of course, and then we have the end. I do like release is a very nice word and sounds nice. I don't like attack though, because I don't ever want to feel like I'm attacking notes. I'm always almost actually beginning with the release, where the tongue releases and then the note is free to start vibrating through the instrument. So I like to call that just beginning, middle, end, just like a good story. And just think how amazing your playing would be if you thought of every single individual note as being its own little story, and then you're weaving all of those together as you play. It's a really sort of whimsical and maybe not totally practical, but a really pleasant thought to think about. And I think if you really put that much care into every single note, then you'll be in really good shape with how great your articulation in particular sounds. Now, the way that I like to think about this is that there's a few options for each beginning, each middle, and each end. So the beginnings that we have, just like actually all of them, there's going to be 3 options, because if you think about when we're playing, you can do pretty much 3 things. You can either get louder, do absolutely nothing, or get softer. And we can do that at each part of the notes. So I'm going to use a little bit different model instead of that graph of like the actual sound. I'm going to do more of like a block of sound, because I like to think of that, and it's a little bit more easy to visualize your sound coming out as a block of sound rather than like an arbitrary point on a wave. So we have the 3 different types of beginnings. The one is where you're going to be getting louder, so you start kind of soft and then get louder. The next one is doing nothing, where the sound happens, it's there, and then it's continuing on. And then the last one is getting softer. So you start very loud and then sort of rapidly decay. So thinking about how each of these might sound in the beginning of a note, this one is can be used occasionally, but is kind of rarer in music. This would be sort of that fuzzy attack where it sort of really sneaks in, and you maybe are thinking of like starting from niente, that sort of like these attacks are really, really difficult and really rare because it's almost impossible to line that up. Even just two people thinking about sneaking in, it's really hard to know like when the sound is actually going to start, and it's really hard to get those to line up extremely precisely. This is the kind of articulation that we typically tend to avoid actually when we're practicing articulation. We don't want any hesitation, and we want to be very in control of when our note and when our sound is actually going to start. This can come up though and be really effective in unaccompanied music where you're trying to be really sneaky or stealthy. Also with unaccompanied music, you number one, don't have to worry about lining up with other people. And number two, it's usually a softer environment so that you can think about being really sneaky and delicate, and the audience will actually be able to hear those very, very soft dynamics at the beginning of these super sneaky beginnings. I'm going to skip the middle one and come back to it and talk about this last one because this is also one that's less desirable. This may look sort of like an accent, but it's not really an accent. This would be a really, really fast accent. This is sort of where like the notes pop out and you're maybe expecting a note to be a little bit more resistance, but then it like comes out really explosively like pa, 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 where it just sort of like pops out unexpectedly, maybe if your reed is too soft or something like that. This happens a lot to people when they're slurring up into higher notes because higher notes want to come out louder in general. So they might be playing a low note nice and good, and then they go up to that higher note and it sort of pops out and can surprise people. Incidentally, that tends to make some issues with high notes where you try to tense up and over control that, but that's an idea for a different video. So this is also pretty undesirable unless you're going for some like really pingy, really aggressive, maybe sometimes in like jazz or popular music that comes up a bit more, but in classical music we usually tend to avoid this as well. That doesn't mean that we don't do accents, but accents are a little bit separate and have more to do with how the beginning of the note relates to the sustain of the note, which we'll talk about. Now moving on to this middle one, this is the sort of nice ideal cookie cutter articulation where your tongue comes off the reed, the air's there to support it, and the note comes out right away. This is the very nice, clear, clean attacks where you know exactly like what volume you're gonna get, everything's really nice and in control, and the note just comes out with ease and a very clear beginning that's very easy to line up with other people because you're really in control of like where that sound is starting. Now for the middle of the note, we have sort of the same thing where we can be getting louder as we go. We can keep everything very steady, and we can also get softer as we go. The thing about the middle of notes is there's a lot of room for variety here. It depends a ton on what kind of note that you're playing. So obviously you can see how like a whole note would be extremely different from a singular 16th note. But one disclaimer, no matter how small, fast, or short a note is, it still has a middle to it. There's no note that's ever a beginning and then straight to the end. There's always that little bit of tone. No matter how dry of a staccato we're going for, we always want to get a little bit of middle and a little bit of tone to the note. That's a quick little bonus tip. Though with longer notes, we have a lot of variety. So you can think of a whole note. A whole note honestly might even have where it comes down and then comes back up or something like that if you have a crescendo or a diminuendo and then a crescendo in there. So the middle has a lot of variety to it, and there's not really any wrong answer for the middle. The one potential bad thing to avoid in the middle of a note is something that might be more like this, where you have a lot of inconsistency and wavering to the note. So maybe you're like, da. It has that really weird variety to it, and it's not smooth. So whether we're getting louder or getting softer, we want to make sure that it's all nice and smooth and nice and controlled. And then for the ends, we still have those same three basic options, right? We can either get louder at the end, we can do nothing at the end, or we can get softer at the end. Unlike the beginnings though, there are a couple options that work really well here, and just one option that is more rare. The rare option is this getting louder at the end. This is sort of like maybe something that happens in marching band or maybe some concert band music, almost never in orchestra music or opera, but it does come up occasionally, maybe more so also in like pop and jazz, but this to me mostly makes me think of marching band, where it's sort of that push all the way to the end of that note, that dee, where you really like sort of like bite off the end and like really push it out there and sort of force it out there. You can see why that's not really preferred in most classical music. We always want a more delicate ending or a good resolution to things. But occasionally this can come up, maybe if you have quarter notes with a crescendo on it, where you want a little bit of that bite to it. Yeah, 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 yeah. It's a really weird ending though, and is mostly used as a special effect, sort of like the same as the beginnings where you start loud, or even the beginnings where you start soft, where it's only a special effect to be used occasionally. Now, the sort of block ending where the sound just stops, this one is one to be very careful of. You pretty much never want to end a long note like this. In fact, I can't really think of any situation where you might want to end a long note like this. This is just a very clear, clean ending where the note's going and then it stops. On a long note, it would sound a little bit weird, like dee, where it's sort of just going and then stops. But on short notes and staccato notes in particular, this works really well. It gives you a really clear end to the notes, really clear space, so that you have that definition of things so that you can play really well together and have the same beginnings, ends, and space to the notes. Deet, 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 deet. That provides perfect cookie cutter notes that are very symmetrical on both sides and can be nice for faster staccato notes. Then this final option is probably the most common. This is like just the nice taper to notes. This tapered ending can vary wildly. It can be a very short little nice taper, dee, dee, just that little bit of taper, or it can be a really long, delicate, almost like diminuendo, where the middle of the note's getting softer and then there's that nice long tail to the note, dee, where there's that really good finish. That's sort of like your end of the note or end of a significant phrase, where it's that long finish to the end there. The taper is definitely by far the most common, even if you're playing like successive quarter notes and you want that little bit of space or a really nice note shape to them, deem, 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 you have that little bit of taper to it as well. So now that we know all of those options for the beginnings, middle, and ends of notes, you can combine them almost like Legos almost, where we can get all of the different kinds of articulations that we might come across. So for example, if we have just a plain old note, the beginning that I would think for that is just our clear, nice beginning. This is going to be the beginning for almost every single note. It goes into a pretty straightforward sustain. We're not doing anything dynamically with it. And then the ending, I think, depending on if there's another note right next to it, then the end of this note could actually be the beginning of the next note, and we just keep going like that. Or if this is like the end of a phrase, we could maybe put a little nice taper on it so that we have that dee, dee, and we have that good finish to it. Now, say that we put a staccato on here where we're going to want more space in between the notes, then that's where we put our ending a little bit earlier, create some space, and then we have that good block of space here in between. If this was going into like a rest, we still might actually want to put this tapered ending instead of going deet, deet, and just being done. We might do that short, clean ending to the first quarter note to create the preparation and space for the next one, but then we can finish nice going into the rest. Deet, 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 deet. So there's just that little bit of different release where it's a quick taper rather than just clipping it off. It's hard to think about clipping notes. We don't want to think about like chopping notes off too much. Just think about your tongues coming back to the reed here, and there's no sound because the reed is stopped from vibrating, and then it comes off the reed and the note's continuing. Just like as if there's a note continuing this whole time, but for a moment our tongue stopped it. We could also add maybe a tenuto onto these notes, and this tenuto would give us a little bit more length. It wouldn't be super short like a staccato, but I think it continues that really good sustain of the note. So we're going to go all the way almost to the next note, just a little bit of space, but we want to not have so much taper because the tenuto, the line, means that we need to sustain all the way through the note. T, T, T. We're keeping the sound really going and not having that taper, but not as much space as if it was a staccato as well. And of course, for one of the more exciting sort of standard articulations we might have is an accent. And for an accent, we're going to have still a clear, clean beginning, no sneaky beginnings for an accent especially. And it's not going to be a super fast decay, but we are going to decay pretty quickly. So maybe we have that same square beginning, but it's a little bit louder, and then it decays all the way to the end of the note. So that way we have a clear, strong beginning, and then that decay that is typical of an accent. Accent, 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 where the beginning is definitely the strongest part of the note, then we have a good long tail. But we always have that middle. And in this case, the middle may actually be this bit of decay here. So this is an example where we don't have just a solid sustain to it, sustaining sustain, but we have a little bit of a decaying sustain where we get softer throughout the sustain of the note. But there is still always good tone in the note. So I hope that gives you some ideas for all of the different kinds of articulations that you might be able to create by thinking of these three parts of the notes. Really, there's an infinite combination. You can see I just put together sort of three random combinations of beginnings, middle, and ends. Not all of these will sound good or be particularly musical, but you can see how you can come up with different combinations and see what might work well for whatever piece of music that you're working on. The other thing that you can vary with this is the length of things too. So we talked about having maybe a longer taper at the end of a phrase or something like that, and it's true of every single thing. Maybe on an accent, you really hold out that beginning loudness and then come away a little bit later and delay the decay of it. Maybe with a sneaky beginning, you really hold out that sneaky beginning for a really long time where it's almost like I have no idea when this note's going to come in. Again, not a good idea if you're playing with other people, but it can be really captivating for a small audience or a small group if you're playing by yourself. There's an infinite variety of how these different things can play out. So I encourage you to experiment with it yourself in your warm-up routine and see what kind of different note shapes you can get and different articulations you can get, thinking of this sort of three-part framework. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video.